Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Hey, just really like to thank you for joining us today, and thanks for coming together with us to hear a little bit about or from our webinar. And this webinar we've titled "The Challenge and Opportunity for Tautakaro," and insights into what you and your farmers need to know. For those who don't know me, I'm Luke Berry. I'm part of the E350 team at Northland Inc. Also a dairy farmer at Hukanuri. So I suppose to these conversations bring a range of hats, which is sometimes good and sometimes maybe a challenge. But today is really about creating the opportunity to discuss and then build our understanding on some of the issues ahead of us, some of the change that's here around or surrounding environmental sustainability, and critically to bring a Northland focus to this. We could say that change is upon us and that there's an urgent need to actively improve the environmental sustainability across our pastoral sector and across our region. And that's change that's driven by a whole range of factors. So that's change from societal expectation, that's change from a central and local government legislation and regulation perspective, that's changing industry standards and changing consumer demands. And so while there's undoubtedly significant challenge in this, there is also opportunity. And the idea, or you could say the vision behind today, is to bring some of these issues to the table, to bring some of the information that's surrounding this to the table, and to help build our understanding around this, and to bring a level of coherence, you could say, to this journey ahead of us. So welcome to today. I'd just like to hand over to Ruben to carry on.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Ruben Wiley. I'm the Land Management Program Manager at the Northland Regional Council. And I'll be your host for this webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping tips for those in attendance. You've probably joined a Zoom meeting before. This one's a little bit different in that you'll see that your microphone and camera is disabled, and that's just to ensure that we get a good flow with the webinar today. And saying that, we really would appreciate receiving questions throughout the webinar presentations. And so there is a Q&A button that you'll see on your Zoom meeting, and that gives you an opportunity to ask questions throughout each of the presentations. And we'll be going through those questions as the presentations are given, and we'll have a question session after each presentation. I would encourage all of you, if you've got questions, just put them down. We won't get through all of them today. We're going to keep the session to hopefully under an hour. But what we'd like to do is compile the questions that we do receive and provide those as a Q&A sheet at the conclusion of this webinar. And if we get a whole host of questions that we can't answer, then that just gives us an opportunity to continue on with further sessions like this. And so without further delay, I'll hand it over to Helen, and she'll be talking to He Waka Eke Noa.
Awesome, thanks Ruben. So while I'm currently a Sustainable Dairying Advisor with Fonterra in Northland, I'm probably taking part today more as a legacy from my recent role as Senior Environmental Change Specialist with Dairy NZ. That included some time down the rabbit hole that is climate change policy. So today I'm going to share some very high level messages around what's been happening in that space, and have to emphasize up front that some of the questions that, that you'll put to me will very quickly get to the end of my understanding and knowledge, at which point I'll phone a friend, and as Ruben said, we'll get back to you on that. I've also, because I haven't actually given a presentation for ages, I've asked Sammy, our Zoom facilitator, to share my slides. So I'm sorry, you're going to have to put up with me saying next slide, please, all the time, but hopefully it'll be better than me stuffing up sharing my screen. So next slide, please, Sammy. So hopefully you're all familiar with the Zero Carbon Act. That sets out targets for emissions reduction for all of New Zealand, but it didn't say how we were going to meet those targets. So He Waka Eke Noa is a partnership between primary industry, government and Māori that is developing a system to achieve that target for biological emissions reduction. That's methane and nitrous oxide, a system that works for farmers. It's involved 13 partners, 6 working groups, a steering group, and an awful lot of work, Zoom meetings, face-to-face meetings, emails flying around over the last 18 months or so to design a proposal to put to the government for approval. Whatever system is agreed on, it will apply on farm from 2025. Next slide, please. Why do we need the He Waka Eke Noa program? The first thing to keep in mind is that reducing emissions is not optional. The choice is not pricing or no pricing. The alternative is to pay per emission at the processor level via the emission trading scheme. So doing nothing is not an option. Next slide. And as opposed to simply paying what would essentially be a pure tax at the processor level through the emissions trading scheme, He Waka Eke Noa is an opportunity for those involved in the food and fibre sector to have a level of control and input into something that works for farmers. It will ensure, sorry, the slides haven't come through right. It will ensure, firstly, that farmers are less exposed to the carbon market. Back in 2019, carbon as a New Zealand unit was valued at just $25 per tonne of emissions. Yesterday, it was valued at $64.50, linking all the emissions from New Zealand pastoral industries to this volatile market that responds to drivers way beyond anything that's happening on farm would not be helpful. Who knows how high that carbon price will go. So secondly, He Waka Eke Noa also gives us the opportunity to treat methane differently to long-lived gases. This recognises that while methane is initially more damaging than carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, it is a short-lived gas, so should be treated differently. There's also the opportunity to ensure that revenue raised from any system is recycled to the sector rather than disappearing into the consolidated fund or wherever it is that ETS payments go. For example, revenue raised could be earmarked for research or to encourage further adoption of mitigation measures. And finally, a bespoke system as proposed by He Waka Eke Noa allows for on-farm sequestration to be recognised, offsetting the cost of emissions within a farm business, just as the trees offset the impact of greenhouse gases on farm. Next slide. So what are the options looking like? But first, as said by Dairy NZ's Principal Policy Advisor in a recent webinar, this is not about pricing our farmers into oblivion. It is about incentivising change on farm though. Doing nothing is not an option. Next slide. So the He Waka Eke Noa process is working on options for a pricing mechanism that would sufficiently encourage or incentivise farmers to reduce their emissions of both methane and nitrous oxide. We don't know the detail yet. People do, but I don't, and the people that do is quite a tight group. But we do understand that they've been working on at least 2 pricing mechanisms. Details on these pricing mechanisms will be released before Christmas, and consultation options will be run in February to get feedback from farmers. Dairy NZ, Beef and Lamb and Federated Farmers will be taking the lead on those consultation meetings. After that, a final proposal will be put forward to government for them to make a decision on how things will look moving forward. Remember that the actual pricing mechanism will kick in 2025. Seems like a long way away at the moment, but boy, it's coming up fast. So the first option is likely to be a farm level emission pricing option that seeks to incentivize reductions via a split gas levy. Basically, a farm's methane emissions, that's A in the equation, would be valued at one rate. Added to the nitrous oxide emissions at its value, B, so A plus B minus C, the amount of carbon sequestered on farm, would give the amount that essentially a levy that the farmer would need to pay. The farmer can then choose whether to pay this full amount each year moving forward, or to take steps on farm that reduce A and B and maximize C and reduce the cost. The second option that may be put forward, and I'm sorry, the line is not on the slide there, would see the Crown impose a flat levy at the processor level on meat or milk, and it would be the processor's option around how that liability is allocated to farmers, how it's used to incentivize emissions reduction. Other options are being considered. I understand they've considered lots of them, and all of these are against the default option of entering biological emissions into the emissions trading scheme at the processor level. We don't know yet which options and how many options will actually be put when we hear it in November, but all will be revealed and we'll have the chance to understand and comment on these options in the coming months. So if this slide has just confused you, then hopefully it has also inspired you or motivated you to really engage and to work out what is coming when it comes out. So next slide, please, Semi. In the last slide, I referred to credit for sequestration. That's the C in the A plus B minus C. At this stage, we understand that this will recognise all native vegetation on farm, riparian and shelter plantings, and existing stands of native bush, which generally are not eligible to gain credit through the emissions trading scheme, and exotic plantings that are not eligible for the emissions trading scheme. Information around the rate of credit and lots of other details aren't available yet, but watch this space. Again, next slide, please. Developing a pricing mechanism isn't the only thing that He Waka Eke Noa have had to do. There's a number of steps and commitments in the whole He Waka Eke Noa program. Some of these process on inclusion of a greenhouse gas model within a farm plan. The guidance for that has come out, the action for that is coming up, while others look to ensure that farmers know their numbers via an emissions report detailing their greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. The first commitment for this emissions report has already been reached. It required that 25% of farmers know their numbers by the end of this year, and that's been completed and indeed surpassed. But getting that to the next step of 100% by the end of next year across all of the pastoral industry may be more of a challenge. Next slide, please. Certainly, all Fonterra farmers received their second annual report on their greenhouse gas emissions in the wider insights report emailed to them a couple of weeks ago. If you're talking to your clients, ask them if they've opened that email or printed it out, or any questions, we're happy to help. Beef and lamb have an emissions calculator on their website and are planning workshops nationally that will include working through a greenhouse gas calculation for your particular farm and the first step of completing a greenhouse gas action plan. The first of these are planned for Silver Fern farm suppliers this month, with workshops in the week of 13th of October. Now that's still on their website, but COVID-related matters may intervene there. But yeah, have a look on that website and yeah, see, just keep in touch there. Next slide, please. So in summary, more details on the proposed pricing framework to incentivize reduced greenhouse gas emissions will be released before Christmas, and they'll be released by people that know what they're talking about and know the nth degree of detail. Farmer consultation meetings on this are proposed for February, and feedback from those meetings will go back to government and government will make the decision. I guess key messages for you and your farmers. I just really encourage you to build your understanding of the proposals and the rationale, to encourage your farmers to be involved. Don't keep your heads in the sand, their heads in the sand, to work with your farmers to build a strong, resilient farm business. That's the best preparation for what's to come ahead of 2025, when greenhouse gas pricing will apply. Next slide, please. So finally, we're not being set up to fail. We can meet the emissions reduction commitments and still have profitable farm businesses, but only if we start to take account of the direction of travel for the emission numbers on our farms now, genuinely and critically work on what will make us more efficient farmers, be it breeding the highest quality animals we can, doing the best with our replacements, looking at options for low-end feeds. There are tools and levers out there. And in Northland, we are lucky that the NAF, Northland Agricultural Research Farm, is doing some farm trials on looking at what it might take to meet some of the short and long-term commitments right here in Northland. There'll be a lot of valuable knowledge coming out of that. So don't delay, do keep calm and keep on farming. And yeah, questions. Although I'm not sure if we're taking questions now. Oops.
Thanks, Helen. Right, so we've got a couple of questions that have come in, and I think we'll start with the easiest one first.
Thank you.
Are the slides likely to be made available after the webinar?
Well, I'm certainly happy to share my slides. So if anyone wants to chat to me or email me, helen.moody@fonterra.com, I'm happy to share them.
Cool. So that's easy to answer. Here's a potentially a trickier one, and just a reminder to everyone attending, if we can't answer the questions in full detail, that's something that we can address in our Q&A document. So I'll just read the question out. Is it too early to have some worked examples to see how the numbers might stack up for the pricing mechanism options?
That's actually quite an easy one. I understand there's been a lot of case studies and worked examples that will be coming out alongside announcing the mechanisms.
Cool. And one final question, and we can potentially address this one fairly quickly. Is the jury still out on climate change?
That's a personal opinion, but the scientific data is fairly clear. New Zealand's policy direction is fairly clear. And look, honestly, possibly as importantly or more importantly, the position of our overseas markets in both sheep and beef and dairy is also very clear. They have their own targets that, yeah, not meeting is not an option.
Thanks, Helen. All right, so we'll move on to our next presenter. And just a reminder, keep those questions coming through because it really helps us to understand where the key issues are that the sector is thinking about. So we'll move on to Brenda Bailey. And she works as our policy specialist at Northern Regional Council, and she'll be providing a high-level overview of the upcoming changes in light of the National Policy Statement.
Morena, everybody, and just to add to Ruben's introduction, I am working in the policy and planning space, but at the moment there's a particular focus of my work around the freshwater, and I'm coordinating our upcoming freshwater plan change. So first slide, please. So as Ruben's mentioned, I'm just going to give a bit of an overview around some of the freshwater regulatory changes that have come up. Next slide, please. Back in September last year, we had an essential freshwater package come out, and that included the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, also a new National Environmental Standards for Freshwater, some stock exclusion regulations, and regulations around the measuring and reporting of water takes. So my presentation is going to focus on the National Policy Statement for Freshwater. My work colleague will be touching on some of these other regulations that have come out. Next slide, please. So the government objectives for the suite of reforms that have come out have been to stop further degradation of our freshwater resources, and they're wanting to see an improvement in our overall water quality over the next 5 years. The other aim is they want to reverse the past damage, and they want to bring New Zealand's freshwater resources, our biodiversity and our ecosystems into a healthy state within a generation. Next slide, please. So the NPS for freshwater management has an overarching fundamental concept called Te Mana o Te Wai. And this is about the holistic well-being of our freshwater bodies, but also their interrelationships with the wider environment and the people that live in it. And so it has a very integrated approach, and it also has an integrated approach from the mountains down to the sea. So in other words, we need to think about not just what we're doing with our fresh water, but the impact that it has as it travels down and out into the oceans. And that Te Mana o Te Wai is underpinned by a hierarchy. And so the first hierarchy is the well-being of the water bodies and the ecosystems. That comes first. Behind that comes the essential needs for people. So that's things like your drinking water. And then everything else comes in third place. So the NPS also has in there 4 compulsory values that we need to look after and manage. So the first one is around the ecosystem health of our freshwater ecosystems. The second is around human contact. Is it safe for me to go and swim there? The third is around our threatened species. And the fourth is around mahinga kai. Can we go and gather food? Is it safe for us to eat the food? Next slide, please. So what the NPS has in it is a quite detailed step-by-step process on how we need to engage with our people to implement this new policy. And fundamental is that we must engage with our communities and our tangata whenua as we go through this process. But in addition, tangata whenua will also have a decision-making role. So the step-by-step process starts off with the identification of long-term visions for your freshwater. Then we look at the objectives or the environmental outcomes. Then it's the identification of your freshwater values. I've given you the 4 compulsory ones, but there are others. And then we need to look at our environmental outcomes or our objectives that we want for each of those freshwater values. Then we need to have a look at the attributes that we need to measure. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. So what do we need to measure around things like our water quality and our biodiversity so that we can see that we're achieving our environmental outcomes for our freshwater? We need to know what the current state is of our freshwater, and that's what's called our baseline state. And if we have some baseline states that aren't perhaps in a very good condition, we need to think about what our target state is. What do we want to get to? And then how much time do we need to get there? And then we need to look at the rules and some action plans to try and achieve this. Next slide, please. So there is quite a bit of technical information involved in this process, particularly once you get down to the attributes. And I'm not going to go through these in detail with you, but just to give you an idea of some of the things that we're looking at. So on this slide here, we've listed out some of the compulsory attributes that the government has set that we need to measure. And in the next column, it tells you the purpose or the value that attribute will be measuring and the water body that it applies to. So you'll see on the first slide there's quite a range of water quality parameters, along with the ones around measuring your algae and E. coli, which is our measure for any microbe contamination we may have in our waterways. Next slide, please. You'll see in this one that it also extends into monitoring our fish and our macroinvertebrates, that's the bugs that live in our waterways, along with more wider ecosystem functioning measures and some other water quality measures as well. Next slide, please. So how are we going to get there? So Northland Regional Council has set out a roadmap on how we're going to get there. And that roadmap is for all Northlanders. We're going to need everybody on board to get there. So as an initial start point, we've set up 2 advisory water groups. The first one is the Tangata Whenua Water Advisory Group, and the second one is the Primary Sector Liaison Group. And I'll talk a little bit more about that one because that is probably of interest to a lot of you that are listening in at the moment. So that group has got representatives from Dairy NZ, from Beef and Lamb, and from Federated Farmers. But we are also got representatives covering forestry and horticulture. And we do expect those representatives, as we work with them, to go back and consult with their members as we go about drafting up a freshwater plan change. We're also going to be going out and doing one-on-one with other key stakeholders out there. So that may be with other iwi and hapu, it may be with our district councils, with DOC, Fish and Game, just other key people to help get input into drafting up this freshwater change, because it is quite different to how it's been done in the past. In the process of getting that draft freshwater plan together, we'll be taking all that input to council along with 3 Maori representatives to develop this draft freshwater plan change. And that is where the Tangata Whenua decision-making process comes in. We're going to have that going out to you all for public consultation, along with a package of supporting information. But while we're going through this, and as that information comes up, please keep an eye out on our Essential Freshwater page on the Northland Regional Council webpage. It's a good place to go to keep you informed on where we're at and how we're progressing. We do have one deadline from the government, and that is in December 2024. We have to notify our freshwater plan change. We are hoping to go earlier than that. We're tentatively looking around around mid to late 2023, but we will see about that. I guess the key take-home message here is we need everybody on board to get this freshwater plan change over the line. So please get involved, get in there and have your say, talk to your representatives, and and get in touch with us if you want to ask anything. And last slide, please.
Kia ora, Brenda. Thank you for that. So we've got one question that's come in, and I'll read it out to you. How many council representatives are there in the group that will develop the draft freshwater plan change? And I think we can assume council representatives are elected members?
Yes, it'll be our elected members, and then the 3 Maori representatives is we have a Tai Tokoro Maori and council group, and so those 3 representatives will come from that group. But what we're doing is the 3 representatives are on the Tangata Whenua Water Advisory Group, so they are 3 members that belong to the Tai Tokoro Maori Council Group, and they will be the 3 representatives that will work with our elected councillors on drafting up the plan change. That gives us continuity from the Tangata Whenua Water Advisory Group right through the decision making with council.
Thanks, Brenda. All right, so we don't have any further questions in regard to this topic. Actually, there's one that's just come in. Is it likely that target attributes will differ between catchments?
That is a possibility. The general approach we're taking at the moment, and just be aware we're at a very high level stage at the moment, is there are some generic aspects of water quality and water quality issues across Northland. And so we are initially looking at target attributes and rules and action plans that may apply generically across the whole of Northland. But what we'll be also looking at is, do we have any specific issues or community concerns in any specific catchments where we might have to do a little bit more extra work to get to the target state that we want to get to. So we're seeing it potentially at the moment, a mix of some generic targets along with, rules and action plans on how to get there, with perhaps some more targeted one for specific purposes.
Thanks, Brenda. So we've just got one item of clarification that's come in, and we'll just answer this quickly so that we can move on. So with regard to the council representatives on the group that you mentioned, how many representatives will be part of that group? Is it the full council?
I think it'll be the full council, but I just have to check on that, but I'm assuming it's a full council.
What we can do with that question is we can address that with our Q&A when it comes out. Cool. Okay, so we will move on to Peter Noel, and Peter will be talking to some major changes that are coming up with the regulations beyond those of the NPS. And Peter is our Strategic Land Management Advisor at Northern Regional Council.
Tēnā koutou, kia ora katoa. Thank you for that introduction, Ruben, and thank you to all our attendees for joining us this morning. Unfortunately, my video is not working, so you won't get to see me today. Yesterday it was audio problems, and today it's video, but no matter, we will continue on. I'm going to be covering some of the other aspects of the government's essential freshwater package and some key changes to environmental regulations, and some changes have already occurred as well. So we're going to get into, there we go, we're going to get into the National Environmental Standards for Freshwater, cover some stock exclusion rules and freshwater farm plans. But before I get into those various components of the essential freshwater package, I also wanted to give a bit of an update on our regional plan as well. So the proposed regional plan for Northland is a newish regional plan. It was notified in September 2017. The idea is that it's one plan to cover the whole region and replaces several older plans, including our soil and water plan, air quality plan, and coastal plan. It is going through the appeals process. However, rules that have not been appealed or that have had their appeals resolved through the Environment Court process are operational, so they are in force. Obviously, you probably don't want to wade through the whole regional plan, although if you're having trouble sleeping, it probably makes for some good bedtime reading. So we do have some common rules for landowners. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's a good summary of rules that commonly apply to activities on farm. And it's a really good set of rules to know before undertaking any works on the farm. Again, some of these rules may be under appeal, so it's best to just check the regional plan first. And you can do that by going to our website, nrc.govt.nz, and just search for common rules, and it will be the first search result that comes up there. Moving on to the National Environmental Standard for Freshwater. Brenda sort of explained the national policy statement for freshwater management, which provides national direction to regional councils on how we should manage freshwater. The national environmental standards for freshwater can be thought of as a set of rules or minimum requirements or standards for activities that impact freshwater. So it was introduced to regulate activities that pose risks to the health of freshwater and freshwater ecosystems. But in many cases, regional plans can impose stricter rules as well, where the national environmental standards and the proposed regional plan overlap. For example, rules around wetlands in both of those documents, the most restrictive rule applies. Now, we recognize that this can be difficult for yourselves and landowners to discern. It's been difficult for us too. So we are working on region-specific guidance. In the meantime, please contact us directly if you're unsure which rules apply or in which situations. And again, there's a bit more information on our website, so I encourage you to head over to nrc.govt.nz and search for new national rules. In terms of the content of the National Environmental Standards for freshwater, there are limits on agricultural intensification. Now, for you and I, we might be thinking in terms of stocking rates there, but actually these limits are more akin to limits on certain types of land use change. So for example, conversion of forestry land or sheep and beef grazing to dairy farming, for example. Just good to be aware that if farmers are looking to buy a block at the moment and convert to dairying, they very well may need a consent to do so. I do want to point out that this particular rule, not the entire environmental standards for freshwater, but the limits on agricultural intensification are temporary. They're due to expire at the end of 2024 when we've worked through that whole process that Brenda just described and have our new freshwater plan notified. In terms of the NES, there are also standards for stockholding areas and feedlots, and this mostly relates to the permeability of the stockholding area and where that's situated in relation to waterways. There are controls on intensive winter grazing, not a widespread practice up here in Northland, so probably not too concerned about that, but good to be aware of. There's a cap on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer use, and probably of more interest, there's also new reporting requirements for nitrogen use. So dairy farms must provide detailed records of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer application to the Northland Regional Council by 31st July each year, and that kicks in next year. We are working with the wider regional sector to make compliance and reporting as easy as possible, and we will communicate that wide and far when we have those sort of reporting systems in place. Finally, there are restrictions on activities near wetlands, things like earthworks, land disturbance, vegetation clearance, damming and drainage, that sort of thing, and controls on structures and rivers. And that's primarily to provide for fish passage. So if you're putting in a culvert or a stock crossing or any sort of structure in a waterway, making sure that fish can still move through or around that obstacle. Next up, stock exclusion rules. So both the Resource Management Act and the proposed regional plan contain stock exclusion rules. So there's national and regional stock exclusion rules. Unfortunately, these national and regional stock exclusion rules do not align very well at the moment. For example, what types of stock need to be excluded from certain waterways and when they need to be excluded from those waterways. So in terms of the key differences, there's a new requirement for a 3-meter setback from lakes and rivers wider than 1 meter in the national rules. There's no setback requirement in our regional rules. NRC's, our regional plan defines a waterway slightly differently as well. So it includes artificial water courses such as drains, the coastal marine area and smaller rivers, but they must be continually flowing for those stock exclusion rules to apply. The national rules, as I said before, apply to rivers wider than 1 meter, but they don't necessarily have to be continually flowing. So that's an important distinction to make. There are also site-specific rules in Northland, so requiring stock exclusion above registered drinking water supplies, whitebait spawning sites, and some popular swimming areas as well. And the regional rules apply slightly earlier in some cases and treat dairy support cattle the same as beef cattle and deer. Where the national stock exclusion rules and the regional stock exclusion rules overlap, again, the most restrictive applies. It's important to recognize that our stock exclusion rules are still under appeal, so they're not yet in force, but we expect a resolution through the Environment Court process early next year, and that's well before the national rules will come into effect, which is either 1st July 2023 or 1st July 2025, depending on the stock type. Regardless of what happens to the proposed regional plan through the appeals process, that national 3-meter setback will be required for lakes and wide rivers. It's more restrictive, so it will apply. So if you are looking to do some, or if the farmers that you work with are looking to do some stock exclusion fencing now, really encourage them to start early and focus on maybe those wider rivers with those setbacks. We are working on region-specific guidance, but in the meantime, please contact us. If you're unsure which rules apply and where, we're more than happy to answer those questions. And likewise, throw those questions in the Q&A now if you've got them, so we know what people are thinking. Again, you can search for new national rules on our website. And if you scroll about halfway down the page, there's a little section on stock exclusion and some really good visuals actually of what the 3-meter buffer looks like, because the 3-meter buffer is from the edge of the bank, not the edge of the water. And that's another important distinction to make. All right. Next up, freshwater farm plans. So you've probably all heard of the new mandatory farm planning system introduced through the RMA. It's going to require all farms with 20 hectares or more of arable or pastoral land use, or 5 hectares or more of horticultural land use, to have a freshwater farm plan. The details, including the timing of the requirements, so when this will actually be mandatory, are still being developed. The good news is they're still accepting submissions until Thursday this week, so you've got 2 days to get your feedback in. And even if you're not interested in making a submission, I would encourage you to head over to consult.environment.govt.nz and just take a read over the discussion document or the summary document to see what the government's proposing in terms of freshwater farm plans. Also, even though we don't know what farm plans are going to look like to come next year for certain, we'd really encourage you to get the word out to your farmers and growers that it's best practice there. It's a good idea to get started on that journey early. Don't wait right before they become mandatory, because you'll cause yourself all sorts of grief and headache. And whatever happens in terms of the mandatory freshwater farm plans, what they require, they're very likely to build on existing farm plan tools. And there's many of those out there in terms of various industry organizations. So start that process early. In terms of Northland Regional Council and freshwater farm plans, we will not be writing, certifying, or auditing freshwater farm plans. I suspect many of you attending today will be doing that. We will be appointing certifiers or auditors under the system to do that work. Our role as regulator is to deal with non-compliance. So if a farm operation, fails its freshwater farm plan audit, we're there to help support that farmer to be able to comply with their freshwater farm plan. We'll also be collecting data and reporting on the performance of the freshwater farm plan system, but not at the individual farm level. So in no way will we be, releasing information on how an individual farm is performing in terms of their freshwater farm plan. We'll be doing that, regionally at a much larger scale. And most importantly, which is why I've bolded this point, we'll be supporting farmers and growers to implement the actions within their freshwater farm plans. We're not quite sure what form that support will look like just yet, but once the freshwater farm plan system rolls out, we will have a plan in place. So I'd really encourage you and encourage you to engage with your farmers, to contact the land management team here at Council to see how we can help your farmers and growers working to implement their freshwater farm plans. And also, I just wanted to mention, if you are working in the Kaipara Moana remediation program is obviously playing a huge role there, and they'll be doing similar work for the farmers and growers in that region or in that area of the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. We've got a couple of good questions that have come in. I'll just read them out, slightly abridged some of them will be. So, Peter, I wonder if you could clarify what the deal is with the term intensification. So we've received a question around whether agriculture intensification includes conversion from livestock farming to horticulture, and whether an activity of that nature would trigger a consent requirement.
Sorry, Ruben. Yeah, great question. So that was if livestock farming to horticulture.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
conversion of livestock farming to horticulture.
No, that would not fall under the NES rules as they are now. And again, those rules are temporary, due to expire at the end of 2024. But no, the main ones are conversion of any type of land to dairy land, conversion of non-irrigated dairy land to irrigated dairy land as well.
And we've just had a recommendation from one of our panelists just to provide some clarification around the application of the NES to existing fences in respect of the stock exclusion requirements. Is that something you're able to answer?
Yep, great question. In terms of the national stock exclusion rules, so they're not actually in the NES, they're in the RMA. But in terms of existing fences, the national stock exclusion rules came into force on 3rd September 2020. So that was last September, over a year ago now. So if there was a fence in place on that date, closer than 3 meters, they can remain in place. But since those rules have come into force, the fences would have to be, adhering to that 3 meter setback in order to meet the standard when the rules come into force, either 1st July 2023 or 1st July 2025. So
Cool.
yeah, if you are building a fence now, even though stock exclusion isn't required until those dates, you do want to make sure that you're following that 3 meter setback requirement.
All right, and we've got a really good question about freshwater farm plans, and it's been one that's been on top of our minds too at NRC. So it relates to the timing around the implementation of the freshwater farm plan. So the question is, will freshwater farm plans be in action before the Northern Regional Plan is changed in accordance with the NPS requirements?
Great question, Stephen. I actually know Stephen, so maybe he's just trying to test my knowledge here. But yeah, so it's very likely, judging on what central government is telling us, that the freshwater farm plan system will be rolled out before we finish that process that Brenda was speaking to, the NPS and the National Objectives Framework. So you're right, there's going to be a bit of an interim period where we don't have all that information. We don't have all the community outcomes, the community values identified. We don't have all the target attribute states just yet. But that's why I'm really encouraging farmers to get on board with farm planning even now, because they're going to be in a much better position to at least get the basics right before all that information is out there, and we're able to provide that, what they're calling the catchment context information. So yeah, farm plans will be rolled out before that information is available.
Cool. Okay, and I'm going to refer one of these questions to David Fern, and it relates to the enforcement tools that we have available. So the question is, what are the enforcement tools that are available, and what are the consequences of non-compliance?
Yep. Hi, I'm David. I'm one of the compliance managers here at Northern Regional Council. And it'll be under the RMA, just the basic breaches or non-compliance to a regional rule or a national environmental standard. And that will be followed up for non-compliance with the same procedures, abatement notices and management plans put in place.
Thanks, David. Okay, now we've got another really good question, and there's sort of two questions in here, so we'll break it down. So the first element of the question is how and who will regulate the national rules, and I'll defer that to you, Peter, if you'd like to answer that.
Yep, and David might be able to jump in as well, but so anything in the NES, we as a council are essentially the regulator that makes sure those rules are followed. As I said earlier, we can come up with stricter rules in our regional plan. More often than not, we can't come up with less strict rules. The issue, I guess, that we're having now is that our regional plan, our current proposed regional plan, was notified in 2017. Whereas the NES, those national rules, came out last year. So there are some initiatives, or there are some instances where our regional rules might be less strict. But again, the more restrictive applies, and we will have to, we'll be required to enforce that and make sure those rules are being followed.
Thanks, Peter. And the other element of the question, I'll have a crack at answering this. How do regional and central rules apply in relation to the Kaipara Moana remediation initiative? And so what I will suggest is we'll provide more details on this in our Q&A brief at the conclusion of this webinar. But in effect, the KMR initiative supports landowners to reduce sedimentation running off from their farmland in order to improve the water quality within the Kaipara Moana. And where there's alignment between that initiative and the regulatory requirements, then effectively there is support through the KMR initiative to enable the delivery of those regulatory requirements. But first and foremost, KMR is about improving water quality, not necessarily giving effect to regulatory requirements through these through the NES or NPS or regional plan changes. All right, and we've got one more question, and well, it's a statement of support that we've done a really good job, so thank you for that. And also a question around the availability of this webinar at the conclusion of today. And I'd like to say that we would like to make it available to those who are unable to attend or who would like to spend some time revisiting what we've discussed, because there's a lot to unpick. So yes, we'll look to make that available at the conclusion of this webinar. And we've just got one more question, and then we'll end the webinar today. Okay, so the question is, will lifestylers have the opportunity to do what they like? Yeah, I think I'll defer this to Brenda. And I think the question relates to landowners who are not farmers, that they're lifestyle block owners. How do the rules affect them? Or the changes?
I'm probably more of on the policy than the rules. so there may be better people to chip in on it, but my understanding is that it will apply to lifestyle blocks, but also taking into account that some of the rules under the NES, which Peter spoke to, that there are area thresholds around that depending on the type of farming activity that you're doing. There's the 20 hectare and 5 hectare thresholds. But if there's someone else there who can better answer around the rules, feel free to speak.
I think what we'll do is we'll answer that question in a bit more detail as part of our Q&A brief following this webinar. The take home is that the rules apply across the region.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, and so it depends on what activities are being undertaken on lifestyle blocks and how those activities might affect freshwater quality.
Yeah, and for the farming activities, just be aware that there's a size criteria that applies as well.
Okay, well, we're coming up to 10 o'clock. We're running bang on time, so we're going to end the webinar here. And I'd like to thank everyone who attended today. We've had a really good turnout. I'm really thrilled with the amount of attendance, and I encourage everyone to just give us some feedback just through the email addresses supplied, in order that we can understand the value of these sorts of mediums to convey this sort of information. And we're quite happy to make it a regular event. And I would also just remind everyone that the land management team at Northern Regional Council is here to provide advice and support around all these changes. So feel free to get in contact with us if you've got any further questions or you'd like to have further discussions on these topics. And so with that, I'd just like to say thank you for attending, and we will hopefully host similar events in the future. Ka kite.